session of the webinar series organized by the CASE, Canadian Association of Sociological Education, and the Canadian Sociological Association Sociology of Education Research Cluster, that is CSA-SE. My name is Isel Yoon. I'm a president of CASE. I'll be chairing this session and facilitate Q&A after Dr. Robson's talk. But before we start Dr. Robson's talk, let me briefly introduce Dr. Elena Butler and Dr. Kathleen Hillier, who are here, who are co-chairs of CSA, Sociology of Education Research Cluster, who helped organize this session. Also, I'd like to thank Sherry Fox, Executive Director of Canadian Sociological Association, who's here, who helped to set up this webinar, especially after we received an overwhelming interest in this webinar. So I actually want to say something about that because there has been some changes that were made. People are registering on Google Forms and then later on through CSA. So just to give you a bit of background to that is initially we organized this webinar as a way to just get together as a small group to talk about our mutual interests. So we have CASE and CSA-SE bringing together. We were really expecting some 20 people signing up, but definitely no more than 50 people, at least in my mind. But so far, I think we have about over 150 people signing up who are interested in this webinar. And so clearly a lot of you have who are here today are interested in what Dr. Robson has to say. So thank you for joining us. And please at the end use Q&A to ask questions to Dr. Robson after her talk is over. We'll try to respond to that as much as we can given our time of just 1 hour. Also, before we begin Dr. Robson's talk, let us begin with the land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. As a visitor on this land, coming from South Korea as an immigrant myself, I'd like to acknowledge the lands on which I am hosting and chairing this event, which are the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Please join me in acknowledging the land that you're on today. And then take a minute to reflect and to consider how we can try to move forward in a spirit of truth and reconciliation and collaboration. And I do believe that today's topic that we're going to be discussing is actually relevant to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's call to action that call upon the federal government to support Indigenous students and families through improved education system. And as researchers we know that how important it is to have then the data that can help us to achieve that. Now, finally, let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Karen Robson. She probably doesn't need an introduction, but I'll just say it briefly. Hello, Dr. Karen Robson. She's associate professor in the Department of Sociology at McMaster University and the Ontario Chair, Research Chair in Educational Achievement and At-Risk Youth. Robson is noted for her work using comparative cohort data to examine the correlates of post-secondary transition in Ontario and beyond. Robson holds a PhD in applied social and economic research from the University of Essex in England. So without further ado, Dr. Robson, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being interested in this. It's kind of gone beyond my wildest dreams of the enrollment. So my talk is based on a paper that you may have seen, and I'm just talking about issues in the paper. I'm not really reciting the paper. It's about things that have come up since in many cases. And the paper itself, just a little background on it, there was a couple years where I was really into op-eds. So these are like angry op-eds that I've written with other people. And the paper itself is kind of like an academic delivery of all of these things plus more. So I've been really concerned in my research program around the absence of race data in education data, the incredible obstacle courses that are presented to us through research ethics boards, and the kind of inaccessibility, at least my perception of how hard it is to access federal data given the RDC structure. So I wrote this thing because when I was talking about these issues, like when you write comparative research papers and you're trying to talk about why your data are only in certain places, there's no race data, it's really difficult to cite things about this and substantiate that claim. And a lot of times I was very limited to say, well, this journalist brought it up, because it's only when journalists talk about it that anybody pays attention. And I was being criticized, like, can't you cite the literature? It's like, well, you can't cite literature that doesn't exist. Like, people don't write about things that don't exist. So I've tried to do that here. So other people can, if they're feeling like this is a weird experience for them, that, why can't I do what I want to do in Canada with data? Well, here's some reasons. And I didn't really see it, like, it's a weird literature complaining about education data. And the only other person I saw in Canada that was really kind of involved in this was Glenn Jones. So I was able to cite him, fortunately. So it didn't sound like it was just me complaining about everything all the time. So what I'm going to talk about today is what I think we need, what it's like in places other than Canada, issues with federal government data availability, provincial and school board data availability. Why not just do everything yourself? The obstacle courses created by RDCs and REVs, and then why are we like this? Like, honestly, why? And there's like cultural Canadian reasons that this is embedded in, and political reasons, and I just kind of want to chat about that a little bit. And then, I didn't want to leave on this despair. What can we do to fix this? How can we start to make this a better data environment for education researchers? So what I think we need, according to me, there are at least two components of data that we need in order to do meaningful, evidence-based research on education policy. Quantitative. The proviso here is quantitative research. The data has to contain important socio-demographic characteristics that are associated with systemic barriers, and this absolutely must include race. The second is that there has to be a longitudinal component. There's lots of cross-sectional studies out there, but they don't help you understand processes. We need longitudinal components to help us identify the areas in the life course where barriers are established, where they're encountered, where people get stuck and stagnate, and where everything goes wrong. So without those two things, we're very, very limited in our ability to inform good evidence-based practice in education. In Canada, we have failed to collect race data in such a spectacular way. It's phenomenal. When you talk to people in other countries and you're explaining your data situation, it's often to shock that when you talk to American colleagues, they can't believe that you don't have race data as a matter of everyday practice and data collection. When I talk to my colleagues in the UK, it's just like, why don't you have that? We've been collecting that for 50 years. Here, it's just not there. It hasn't been, it's increasingly becoming there, but it has historically been absent. One thing that COVID discussions have had to force in data collection is, at least in public health data, has been the collection of race data. During the beginning of the pandemic, it was really interesting to watch these discussions take place in the media around why we can look to the US and see the incredible disproportionate rate of COVID infections in racialized communities, but we can't do that here. And so in 2020, we began collecting race-based statistics in COVID with the assumption, and I don't know if this ever happened because I don't do health statistics, but the assumption that having that information would help us inform targeted interventions to those populations to help with infection control, spread, et cetera. In social science and the cognate disciplines, we can look at various data sources and see that they have taken spectacular, incredible side steps to avoid asking people about race. We have language spoken at home, immigrant status, visible minority, first generation, born in Canada, everything but, like, these are all, arguably race adjacent, but they are not race. They are other things that we are using as proxies. So my dream data, and I don't think it's a large ask, I really don't, has to have four things. It should be representative of Canada, so that you're not just talking about one municipality. It collects race data, among other important socio-demographic factors. It's current, so we're not talking about stuff from 20 years ago. And it collects K-12 information, as well as linking it to post-secondary and labor force outcomes. So that, I don't think that is unreasonable amount of information to be asking for, but this does not exist in Canada, at least in the form I would like it to, like microdata. It does not exist. So what's it like in other places? So, I mean, this is really a Canadian thing. I've had the privilege of opportunity to work in other countries, the US, the UK, and Ireland, and it's not like that there. I worked in the University of Essex, which has an amazing UK data archive with literally hundreds of data sources that you can download, including qualitative data, incidentally. I've worked at UCL, University College London, which is the home of the big cohort studies, the birth cohort studies, the first one that started in 1958. There was at least 5 of them, ongoing. They all have their own research units, all associated with University College London. I have these data on my computer. There's Growing Up Ireland, which is a longitudinal study of Irish children. Again, I have these data on my hard drive. And then there's the longitudinal surveys of Australian youth. And I'm working with people in all these countries currently, and I'm able to look at their data by signing a few forms that say that I'm not going to behave inappropriately with their data. I just get it, just put on my hard drive. I can analyze it myself. All they ask is that I promise not to be horrible, and that, when I write a report, that I share it with them. So this data situation is not like this in other places. They have kind of a trust relationship with me going forward. In Canada, the federal data sources are very different. So we used to have 2 great studies. We used to have the Youth in Transition Survey, which was great. And we used to have the NLSCY, the National Longitudinal Study of Youth and Children and Youth. And those have been discontinued since 2008. Like Harper, those are gone, and there's no plans that I know of to kind of revive these or to create new ones in their place. There's other data sources that you can use for some things. There's PSIS, there's everybody seems to be using the Education Labor Market Longitudinal Platform now. That seems to be like the thing to do. And then there's the Longitudinal International Study of Adults, the LISA, but none of these contain my 4 criteria. They're always missing on one, and I believe it's always race, at least. But I know that there's efforts being made to merge in the Toronto District School Board data onto at least 2 of these platforms. So there is some of that going on, but to me, there's an additional barrier, and I don't like to be flippant about this, but I really do find the process of accessing RDC data to be onerous and, quite frankly, insulting to the integrity of researchers, especially when I have other countries that just send me a zip file and it's on my computer. They don't require me to go through all of these processes of like I have in the past. Don't get me wrong, I have RDC experience, but the application that I actually had to do R&Rs on, oaths to heads of state of fingerprinting now, credit checks, and to all work in a place that's not my house, on a computer that's not mine, with hours that may or may not correspond to my lifestyle choices. So I mean, this isn't to slam the RDCs. I know they're trying to do great work on the Data Liberation Initiative, and this is it's good that it exists, but when you compare it to other situations, it comes up quite short, in my opinion. Just my opinion. So what are the provinces doing now that I've decided that the feds are kind of a lost cause? What are the provinces doing? Very little. The only exception to this is British Columbia. They have this really great data source, the Student Transition Project, and I have had the opportunity to work with these data, not personally, because you have to live in BC to work on them, but on research teams. And it's pretty good. They've been using the personal education number, the PENS they call it. It's like our OEN in Ontario, the Ontario Education Number, which a student is assigned as soon as they enter the public education, and then it follows them for a very, very long time. So they've been able to create this really great administrative data set. Administrative, now it means that there's not really any kind of attitudinal stuff. It's all just grades and kind of objective measures of achievement, et cetera, and their post-secondary trajectories. And, you know, it's good for what it is. It'd be great if other provinces had it. But one of the problems with this data is that, again, they don't measure race. It's an admin data set. It's never asked in administration, apparently. And I have had 2 papers with these data set, and we've proxied it with language spoken at home. And I've never felt right about that. Like, what is language spoken at home? What is that even measuring? It's assuming that all racialized people don't speak English, for one, and it's absolutely not, it's not an equivalent at all. So it's good that there's a resource of some sort being offered by a province, being somewhat transparent about their data collection processes, but it's still coming up short. So there's some really great cohort studies in Canada that have been pioneered by important social researchers that have really, I mean, it's incredible life's work. These are like legacy projects for these people. And I just want to draw attention to them because these are projects that have been going on for decades that contain really, really rich data on the life courses of students in high schools and post-secondary institutions, following them for decades. And there's 3 studies at the University of Alberta that do this, that were created by Professor Harvey Cron. They're still in collection. I had the really great privilege of being an undergraduate working on these projects, and it's so amazing to see them still going on in 2021. There's the Class of 73 project, which is at York University, which is Paul Anisef's legacy project. It was a 1973 high school graduating cohort across Ontario, and just a couple years ago, I'm involved in that. We went to the field and collected the 46-year follow-up. So that's the longest longitudinal project in Canada, to our knowledge. And then Leslie Andres out in UBC, she's been collecting data on a high school graduating class of 1990 for some time, and is still an active survey on Path on Life's Way. So these are important cohort researchers in Canada that's kind of done it on their own without the feds. But the thing about this that you have to remember, if you're getting in your mind, like, I should do my own cohort study, the thing is that when these started, these had massive amounts of provincial support. It was like the Ministry of Labor, the Ministries of Education, they supported these projects with money. And you don't see calls for that. And at least in Ontario, you don't see calls for that. So these are great resources. Could they be replicated today with the kind of budgets that were given? I doubt it. So I've been working personally with the Toronto District School Board data for nearly 10 years due to my relationship with the board research group. And it has been a real gift because they have linked those records to Ontario applications to college and university. And at that time, and basically it still is the only kind of longitudinal education data available in Canada that has race information. Unless there's something that came out in the last week that's it. That's the big one. And we've published on that extensively. And it's always been my dream. When I first became the research chair, I had this dream that, you know, all boards would do this, that they would allow access to all of these data, and then we would put it all in one giant data set, and we would know everything about at least Ontario. And there was some hope when in 2017, the Ontario Education Equity Action Plan passed regulation that all school boards now must collect a student census. So they must collect student census data because of the Anti-Racism Act, and this all must be reported by 2023. Some reporting of this has to happen by 2023. So you see little tricklings of this coming out. You see tricklings of it coming out from every board is doing it on their own timeline. So there's no consensus on when the first report has to be done. So we've seen reports coming out of Durham. We've seen them coming out of Grand Erie, York Region, Peel, Limestone, or Simcoe. And so basically they're showing the same patterns that Toronto has been showing for some time. But there's many more boards left to report on this. And so that's exciting. Maybe they'll give us the data. No, they probably won't. I've already been nosing around in there trying to see what boards would maybe let me look at it. And there's incredible amounts of privacy legislation that prevents any board from actually sharing the microdata with researchers to be able to use. So they have to adhere to FIPA guidelines, which is the Privacy and Information Commissioner Office of Ontario. It's very lengthy and exhausting to read, to be frank. They have to do their own privacy impact assessment, and in many cases they don't even store the data at their own boards. It's stored by a third party. It's really very bureaucratically exhausting to look at, and basically what it comes down to is those data will probably never be available to us as researchers at the board level. Okay, so what do you do? Well, you can try and collect it yourself, but with a $40,000 SSHRC Insight, or 400,000 SSHRC Insight grant, that's not going to cover anything very large. So unless SSHRC starts making special calls for data collection that are much larger, this is not really a viable solution. I mean, I've had these Insight grants for 400,000 to use secondary data, and I've spent it all. Like, to collect data, longitudinal data, it's a lot of work. So if you want like a representative sample, you have to go to various sites, you have to have a team, and it doesn't end when your data are collected. You have to have a team in place to ensure that your cohort, or the people that you want to actually interview again, that you don't lose their contact information. So you have to have a whole tracing unit going on. Like these big studies that happen in other countries, like in Michigan, and the big youth studies that occur in other parts of the world, they all have massive amounts of staff working on this all the time. It's not one SSHRC Insight team that is saddled with the kind of labor that this would involve. You also, depending on where you are a scholar, the REB situation, the interpretation of what the guidelines are for the TSPS, the Tri-Council policy, it's quite frankly a nightmare trying to get any kind of research off the ground that involves minors. You're basically doing as much work on your REB application as you are on every other aspect of your data collection when you get to that point. So it's quite frustrating and discouraging that, to me, these institutions are very, very much discouraging actually doing research by the amount of bureaucratic stuff that they throw at you to prove that you're not a horrible researcher. And then there's also the possibility of coordinating the existing data that exists. So, the province has data, they collect it, it's there. The boards have data, they collect it, it's there. The universities have data, they collect it, it's there. you can create these sorts of partnerships where all these places talk to each other and agree to do a data sharing agreement. But this is incredibly time consuming. I mean, I am involved in one of these, and although the project is moving forward, it is moving forward at a very slow rate, because there's lots of uncertainties about in the past. I mean, it's all sorted out now, but at the beginning, there's no kind of framework for how to do this because it's all new. People are concerned about privacy laws. People are concerned about what the safety of doing this because it hasn't been done. It's like, it's not normal. It's not a normal course of action. Data sharing has not been normalized in Canada. So it's frightening for people that own data to actually agree to give it up somewhat. So it sounds like a good idea, but be prepared for a long wait to actually get any kind of results. So why are we like this? I mean, why is this data landscape like this in Canada? Why can you get stuff so much easier in other countries? Well, there's a lot of reasons for this culturally, historically, politically, and I mean, I can like touch on some of them. And one is that our reliance on federal data sources, when we rely on federal data sources, forces us to comply with the Statistics Act, which was written in 1918 or some distant past year like that. And in order to work with the data, you have to become a deemed employee of the Statistics Canada and follow all of these guidelines. And the guidelines have gotten more and more stringent over time. When I was working in the RDC, we did not need to be fingerprinted and credit checked. So those two things are new. So the interpretation of the Statistics Act and what we are doing to protect the privacy of the people that fill out surveys is open to interpretation. And the interpretation that occurs in Canada is always starting at all of these levels of decision making, is always starting with the assumption that we have to prove that our researchers are good enough, that we have to prove that we're not going to be nefarious researchers, that we have to prove our worthiness to this. And that is not something that you see in other countries. Every level of these bureaucracies requires that first and foremost, we have to prove our worthiness. Another issue is that education is a provincial matter in Canada. Provincial governments have to be interested in doing it. So Canada's weird that way. I'm sure you all know that jurisdictionally, education is provincial. Every other country has federal education system. We do not. So every province gets to decide how they're going to do it. Provincial governments are not interested in that right now, not just because of COVID, but it's just like, why would they want to find out all this stuff? You definitely would have to have an equity agenda that you believe in to want to find this stuff out. And this is not, it's clearly not an agenda that in Ontario. I mean, I don't think it's a radical thing to say. They don't want to know these things. So why can't we look at our university and college data? They should be able to just hand that stuff over. And maybe they do at your institution, but it is not so easy because post-secondary education data is considered proprietary. And that means the university or college owns the rights to it. And they own the right to it in a way that is viewed in terms of like a capitalistic competitive edge. So they don't want to hand that stuff over publicly because they don't want to lose their marketing profile. They don't want bad news to come out because it might hit their enrollments. This is a control tactic to preserve the face of the university as a brand. So what I've said in the past and what others have said in the past is that we really need a political champion here. We need somebody that's going to say, yes, we really need that. And we had that for a while. I think Mitzi Hunter was all on board with race data, and now we're having it at the board level. So that's great. But this is not a popular topic for politicians want to get associated with, because when we talk about any kind of data, any data, It's associated with identity theft. It's associated with poor management of self on social media, other privacy concerns that are generally associated with big data. So they think that it will make them look big brotherish if they are really concerned about that image. So as soon as the politician starts talking about data sharing, it makes it sound like they're handing over all of your personal information to some kind of identity theft risk, et cetera. It's a very unpopular thing because people don't understand just how really harmless this is, these sorts of processes, and how much they can benefit the education system, at least in my eyes. And we're still really uncomfortable talking about race, even though it's coming up more and more in media discussions, and it's appearing in various data, at least at the board level. Nobody wants to talk about it. There's still a resistance to accept that we're not any better than the US, for example. There's a massive cultural resistance to this still. So that's why we're like this. There's many more reasons we're like this. I only have half an hour to speak today, so those are the ones I chose. But like, what do we do? Is there any hope? And I didn't just want to end my talk on, it's pointless, give up. No, I don't believe that at all. But I believe that we have to put our efforts where they're not wasted. And believe me, I've been trying to make inroads here for at least 6 or 7 years. So what do I think? What's the best course of action? And it's weird to go to an obituary, but I'm really thinking, like, you have to look to what your mentors did. And I look to, my mentors was Professor Cron and Professor Anisep and others. But when I worked at CLS and the longitudinal studies, and I worked on the British cohort study of 1970, doing the analysis there, we're often reminded that Neville Butler was the guy that invented these cohort studies in the UK. And Neville Butler invented the first one in around 1958, and it's still collected. It's the NCDS, National, I can't remember what it's studied. It's just a birth cohort from people born in 1958, and they still collect data on it. So these people are, retired now, and then the 70s cohort exists and still collected upon, and those people are in their 40s, 50s now. But those studies were not created as education studies. We use them now as education studies, absolutely. Education researchers rely on those cohort studies like you wouldn't believe, but they were never created for that purpose. Neville Butler was a pediatrician, and he invented those studies to study how infant mortality, how the then new National Health Service, how that was going to impact on pediatric health. All these health concerns were what he invented these cohort studies for. And they continued to exist, and other people, other disciplines jumped on and said, hey, can you add some of the questions that we'd like to know about these education markers? Can we interview some teachers, et cetera, et cetera? And we all know that CIHR people make way more grant money than we do. Like 400,000 is peanuts to CIHR people. So we have to remember that the greatest studies that exist on youth in existence all started as health studies. And it's not just those cohort studies. It's the Dunedin study in New Zealand, amazing study, started by health people. AdHealth, which has health in it in the US, amazing study, started by health adjacent people, at least, Sociology of health people, I believe. So why not go with that? Why not go with that? And this is my radical suggestion to you all. Why don't we talk to some of these people doing these longitudinal health studies of cohorts that already exist, established health cohorts of children, the same age children that we want to know about in terms of education. We have a child, it's an acronym, cohort study. It's at, one of the sites is McMaster. And if you're like, Karen, why don't you know these people? Well, they're over in like the hospital. I don't really have much communication with the hospital people, but maybe I should be talking to these people. And then there's another one, the COMPASS system. They have a COMPASS CIHR. It's a prospective cohort study. It has a sample of secondary school and grade 9 till 12 students, exactly who we want, followed over time. These are both in Ontario and in Alberta. So these COMPASS sites are in 2 places. So it's my radical idea that we start talking to the health people and try and see if they will let us jump on, not for free, maybe we can bring some of our SSHRC money over to their CIHR and see what we can do combining our resources with the health sciences to get some really good data out there where we're not relying on feds, we're not relying on the province, and we can actually get data with the 4 criteria that I think are so important for evidence-based practice in education research. So who's with me? Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Robson, for your presentation and articulation for such an important issue for all of us to think about, but hopefully to act on. So I appreciate your last 2 slides about how we can move forward with these challenges. So that's really helpful. I'd like to just invite all of you to pose your questions into Q&A box. So I know that you are able to send your comments through chat, but that's not really going to be shared with everybody. But if you pose your question or even a comment that you want to speak, then please put them into Q&A. That way we can share with Dr. Robson and try to respond as much as we can today. So to start with, we have